This week on Arizona Illustrated, they clean the air, provide shade and shelter, and calm the soul. Trees. The 20th century's premier political prankster, Dick Tuck. And a look back at some of the westernmost battles of the Civil War, right in the shadow of Picacho Peak. Welcome to Arizona Illustrated. I'm Tom McNamara. You've no doubt heard of the 3 R's to improve the environment. You got reduce, reuse, and recycle. Well, here's another. PT, planting trees. Trees remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, produce oxygen, create shade, which can reduce your electric bill. They can even increase the value of your home. Planting trees can also bring communities closer and deepen their roots.
People have been planting trees for centuries, and that effort has been intensifying in Tucson for decades. Tens of thousands of new specimens are growing in the city thanks to a cooperative effort that helps Mother Nature and human beings.
I think it's so important, and it's so important especially in Tucson where there's not a lot of green, for kids to have a chance to go and be in nature, and just for the community to see it and appreciate it and value the environment as well.
Anything that's in the path that's going to get big, we're just going to take it out.
Okay.
At Changemaker High School in Tucson, students are improving the surrounding area by getting out of the classroom and into the community. There is in-depth discussion, interactive engagement, and a commitment to action. When Adilena Rivera started talking to nearby residents, some expressed a desire for more greenery in the neighborhood. The school searched for resources and made contacts. Now, a wish is turning into reality, one little tree and one committed volunteer at a time.
We went around to do some surveys to see how people would collaborate more. And Trees for Tucson came and they started showing us how to plant trees. They trained us how to plant the trees.
Tucson's mayor is also here. He's been promoting planting trees since he was first elected to office in 2011.
It started out with just sort of a comment where I said if 2 people come together who might think they're different politically and they plant a tree, they'll find they have more in common than they have it different.
For student Adilena Rivera, the experience has also helped her in unexpected ways. The trees are growing and she is flourishing, learning new skills, including communication.
I used to be a very shy person, the corner of this desk, don't talk to no one. And now it's like, I want to get my word out there.
A few miles east of Changemaker High School, residents from the Rincon Heights Neighborhood Association near the University of Arizona began their own community beautification program in the late 1980s. Today, the fruits of their labor, which includes native plants and water harvesting systems, are thriving.
These are established trees we planted about 25 years ago, and before we planted them there was nothing here. It was just very barren and hot, and now we have almost continuous canopy in the summertime, so it's nice and shady when it's leafed out.
The transformation has taken years of work and cooperation, and it's still a work in progress. Melody Peters has been there all the way, digging, weeding, planting, prodding, and encouraging.
It's always rewarding. It sometimes has been a great deal of work, organizational and bureaucratic, getting permits, getting buy-in from the residents who are receiving trees is sometimes very difficult, but it's certainly rewarding.
When I first brought them here, they were this big. They were in a Dixie cup. And I planted them through Dixie cups. Didn't have to dig a really big hole at that time, but I guess the hole was sufficient because they sure have grown well.
It began because we had 2 landscape architects in the neighborhood who heard about Trees for Tucson starting a program they called back then Global Relief. The idea was to try to mitigate climate change by planting lots of trees. So they wanted to get a whole bunch of trees planted right away. So we jumped in on that program.
Is there going to be any kind of picnic table where they can sit under the tree or?
Yeah.
Joan Lionetti has been the executive director of Tucson Clean and Beautiful since 1987, which oversees Trees for Tucson. Tucson Clean and Beautiful is responsible for various programs, including the trees, whose canopies are expanding all across the city.
We've planted since 1989 approximately 165,000 trees throughout the community. With people, we haven't. The community has planted it. And so it tells you when you have an idea or a challenge and you move forward on it, and it's coming from the ground up, it's going to work.
I get to drive all over town, get to see people's yards, see how their trees are doing over the years, give them recommendations as far as maintenance and care of their new trees. It's a great experience. I tell a lot of people it's probably the best job I've ever had. I even get that from a lot of people that even ask me, is this the best job you've ever had or what?
I just love trees. They're so good for the environment. They're so good for the native wildlife, if you plant native trees especially.
It's our dress code, it's our economic development, it's social.
It's just really caught a lot of energy, and today we had probably 70 volunteers out here. People love planting trees. I just am so grateful for the attention to the importance of more trees. They plant trees, they prune trees, they learn about why trees are important, and they do, it's really community development.
I think it's awesome. I completely enjoy stuff like this, just getting out and doing stuff instead of being stuck in the house. And it's just nice to be able to see people smile for just a tree being planted.
And the future looks bright for urban forestry in Tucson. Several thousand more saplings will be going into the ground this year.
From time to time, we come upon a person who reminds us that Arizona is a place where a great variety of people choose to live. People with extraordinary life experiences and stories. Dick Tuck is just such a person, and here are but a few of his stories.
Assisted living facilities like this one on Tucson's east side are filled with stories of life, love, loss, and regret. Rooms house residents who have survived the last half of the 20th century and have seen the world transform drastically. This particular room belongs to Dick Tuck, and he's got some stories, based in truth, with room for exaggeration, but legendary nevertheless. Dick was born in Hayden, Arizona in 1924. His family ended up here for the same reason many people were in Arizona at that time: copper.
Today, her mines produce nearly 1/2 of the nation's copper.
My father was a Harvard man and a pioneer in copper, but my mother was smarter than he was. My mother was a brilliant woman. And I had 3 older brothers who raised me.
He recounts watching football in Tucson as a young boy, but not the University of Arizona.
Notre Dame used to come to Tucson every other year and spend 3 days before they would go on to play USC. And we would come from Hayden and visit, watch the team, and Rockney was the coach.
Time to convert the industries of peace into war.
Dick served in World War II.
Train them in the use of new weapons.
And later he would come to know Ernest Hemingway.
I had drinks with Hemingway the night before, And the next night, I had drinks with him, and he went home and took a shotgun and killed himself. That was a well-known story, and it was all true.
While unique, these stories are not what Dick was known for, but his story is so complex it's hard to know where to start. So how about here, at his wedding day?
This is Joyce Daly, to those of you.
It's 1989 at the Woody Creek Tavern in Aspen, Colorado. Dick is getting ready to marry Joyce Daly. It's a sweet and somewhat ordinary scene.
I do have a wedding present.
All right. You're at the right time.
Until Hunter S. Thompson shows up with a loaded .357 Magnum.
That's all right, Hunter. That's okay. That glass lasts as long as most of Hunter's marriages.
Thompson breaks a glass, and the ceremony continues. After the ceremony, Thompson shoots a hole through a copy of Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972, and gives it to Dick as a wedding present.
You might look for your name in there.
Yeah, we're all in here.
No,
You see, Dick is mentioned in the classic book multiple times.
Well, he was pretty good. He was a little crazy.
All right, gang.
But I got him all the credentials he ever needed to get into the Democratic or Republican convention.
Dick was a writer and a political operative involved at the highest levels of American politics. After World War II, he decided he wanted to get involved in the political process. In 1950, while working on the U.S. Senate race of Helen Gahagan Douglas, he would meet his nemesis, Richard Nixon.
Nixon smeared the hell out of her. Pink was for the communists. She was pink all the way down to her underwear, he would say to people.
In response, Dick volunteered to help organize a Nixon rally, without revealing his true plans to sabotage it.
Nobody was on campus, and I also picked a time that was no good, and I picked the largest auditorium, and about 200 people showed up.
There he was, a huge auditorium, very low attendance, and a bunch of media.
When the speech was over, Nixon stopped and got me and said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Dick Tuck." And he said, "Tuck, you've made your last advance." Well, anyway, it turned out it wasn't my last advance.
But our disagreement is not about the goals for America.
10 years later, Dick was working on the John F. Kennedy campaign. After the now famous televised debate, Dick hired an elderly woman wearing a Nixon button to approach Nixon and say, "That's all right, son. You'll get him next time." This was the first indication to Nixon that he'd lost, and the prank made headlines.
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
I learned very early on the way news works. If you had a good story, then you would be in tomorrow's paper. Well, I got pretty good at figuring out what a good story was.
Politics is an important process, but it's also often a fundamentally absurd one. So it's got a rich tradition of political tricksters who have been involved in goofing on the process, and Dick certainly stands among the top of those political tricksters.
Legend has it he hired a group of pregnant women to hold signs that said "Nixon's the one" at a rally, and once signaled a train to start pulling out of the station while Nixon was still giving a campaign speech off the back of it.
The train leaves the station while Nixon's still giving his speech. Yeah, that was another classic moment.
For many years and many different campaigns, the hard-to-prove but nonetheless legendary pranks continued, so much so that Dick was mentioned in Nixon's autobiography.
When you actually get yourself on the president's radar screen, you know that you've succeeded in really getting under his skin, and I think that's something that Dick Tuck was able to do in a way that was humorous and not especially mean-spirited, but very funny guy.
Mental Floss called Dick the greatest prankster in political history. The New York Times called him the 20th century avatar of campaign tomfoolery. And the New Yorker dubbed him the 20th century's premier political prankster. Despite the pranks, Nixon offered to help campaign for Dick when he ran for the California State Senate in 1966.
Yeah, it was partly serious. I thought I had a chance.
Dick announced his candidacy in a cemetery.
Went out to Forest Lawn, and, you know, the people who are dead have the right to vote too. The slogan was that the job needs Tuck, and Tuck needs the job. I mean, it was.
He didn't win, but still made headlines when he lost.
He was apparently the first one to coin the line after losing an election, "The people have spoken, the bastards."
Happy Tuckmas Eve. The reason for the season.
On this day, a small group of fans and friends gather to celebrate Tuckmas Eve.
It's Dick Tuck's 92nd birthday almost, and he does not like calling it his birthday. He calls it Tuckmas.
Today I'm only 91. Tomorrow I'm going to become a geezer. I've decided on that.
I always love looking to older people who have lived their life well, and I think that Dick's curiosity, sometimes it's gotten him in trouble, but I think mostly it's gotten him into really beautiful situations and has brought him to where he is today. A life well lived, an interesting life.
A life well lived, but not without some painful memories. Dick also knew Robert Kennedy well.
Well, the first thing I noticed about him, he talked funny. He was a Boston kid. And he and I became very, very good friends. And then when he ran for president, I was with him. I was standing next to him when he was shot in the Ambassador Hotel. Bobby was really the smartest of the Kennedys. He was an amazing guy. And the world would have been better today if I had taken that bullet instead of him. But that was a choice I didn't have to make. But I used to think about it occasionally.
Back in his room, in a world that has changed many times since he arrived in it, this 92-year-old geezer still religiously watches the news.
If Trump is the final candidate and runs for president of the United States, I think that's the end of the Republican Party. He even got the Pope to get mad at him. I mean,
this is the first presidential election Dick has not covered in over 60 years. His feelings are mixed.
I'm 92 years old. I mean, you know, I knew everybody and everybody knew me 40 years ago, but it's a different world.
In the 1860s, the New Mexico Territory included the land we now know as the states of Arizona and New Mexico. When the Civil War erupted, both the Union and the Confederacy had designs on the territory, so it's no surprise that conflict would result. That conflict and the men and women involved are remembered every year in mid-March at Picacho Peak State Park.
Gun ready!
My father used to tell me,
fire!
When man does not learn from history, he's doomed to relive it. These boys come back year after year after year. Some of them have been doing this for 30 years. I'm from Louisiana. None of my relatives that went off to fight, none of them came back.
Robert Ellender is an Arizonan and a history buff. Today, he plays a Confederate officer with the 6th Texas Infantry.
We try to kind of keep it humorous and interesting, and there's a respect for both sides. We're not out here to grind an axe.
Yankees, get out of town!
Even though what we do pales in light of what these other men before us went through, it still gives you a perspective.
We're in a visual age, and
People, if they don't see it, they won't believe it. So this way they can actually come up to us, they can talk to us, they can feel the uniforms, they can smell what we're cooking, they can feel the weapons, they can see how we lived.
Those Pima Indians come here and support us in a few more.
As battalion leader, Andrew Garcia's role is to prepare and bring Union forces together. He's portraying an officer of the 1st New Mexico Infantry.
Out west, where you have to carry everything you need, from your food, your medicine, your clothing, your equipment, all that has to be carried out here, and there's no local supply to get it from. Can you imagine walking hundreds and hundreds of miles just to go from one water hole to another water hole before you even find the enemy? Those guys had to be tough back then.
Garcia has been reenacting since the bicentennial in 1976. He was 21 years old.
I also was interested in the history of the Hispanic military as well, something you really don't read a lot about. And so I started getting more involved in researching the 1st New Mexico, which was a large Hispanic unit in the Civil War. You had literally thousands of Hispanic troops join to fight for the Union. They stayed loyal to the flag. I think a lot of people forget that, especially nowadays when they doubt a Hispanic can be a loyal American, and thousands were in the Civil War.
1, 2, 1. 1.
Spectators spread across the northern slope of Picacho Peak, a natural amphitheater to the battlefield below.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me set the scene for you here just a little bit. 1862.
Union soldiers gather to the west, and Confederates to the east.
Check the oil of all the reenactors out here. You'd find some very common things. Number one is they all love history. Number two, they love their nation. And all of us agree also that to really understand America, you have to understand the Civil War because it defines what we are as a nation, both good and bad.
7 southern states seceded from the Union following the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860. More would follow. The American Civil War began when Confederates bombarded Union soldiers at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina on April 12, 1861. The battles fought here today represent the Confederate attempt at westward expansion.
The South wanted a nation that went, like the North, that went from ocean to ocean. And there was a lot of Southern sympathizers over here. None of my relatives that fought in the Civil War, they were from the South, believed in slavery. They weren't fighting for that. You say, well, what were they fighting for? Because it was over preservation of the Union and states' rights.
The South often says it's for states' rights, but the only rights that state had that other states didn't was the right to own a human. They say it comes down to economics. Well, yes, free labor as opposed to slave labor, but it comes down to slavery. They're trying to push their economic system. And with slavery, if it's not growing, it's dying.
Fire! 3 battles will be fought here today. The first is the Battle of Val Verde, originally fought on the banks of the Rio Grande in what is now New Mexico, February 1862. Followed by the Battle of Glorieta Pass, fought weeks later in the snow and the cold of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Often called the Gettysburg of the West, it proved to be a decisive end to Western expansion by the South.
When the shooting starts and the smoke builds up from the black powder in the cannons, they can't hear, they can't see.
And those blasts going out, and you can imagine, and boys going down. And when you read their diaries, they would tell the story, and they would say what their commander was saying. Things like, pour it into them, boys. Hold steady, hold steady. Those things we would record, look, this is what they heard.
A lot of regiments or companies, they would join out of like family groups or village groups. So if you can imagine, there's your cousins and your brothers and friends all together in a company, and suddenly you're marching to battle, and next thing you know, your best friend has been blown apart by a cannon. There's your cousin going down from a musket ball. There's your uncle being knocked off his horse.
And it was a bloodletting. It was a terrible time. Our nation almost got cut in half.
After all the carnage and vitriol of battle subsided, there were times when the rules of war allowed for a ceasefire, a truce initiated by a white flag.
Now the two commanders, both Union and Confederate, are meeting in the middle of the field.
Well, it's not really a surrender flag, it's a parley flag. You're supposed to honor that. You don't shoot on a white flag.
So-called honor in the war.
When a conflict had reached a certain point when the casualties were very heavy and you're just exhausted, your men are exhausted, your horses are exhausted, you just can't go any further, you may just say, let's bury our dead, let's gather our wounded, and we'll start again tomorrow. And plus, it's early in the war. The late war animosity and all that hate really hadn't developed quite at that time.
The last presentation of the day is the Battle of Picacho Pass, for which this annual event is named. And the battle actually did take place near these grounds on April 15, 1862. A Union detachment from the 1st California Cavalry led by Lieutenant James Barrett was sent to investigate reports of Confederates near Picacho.
Are you a Confederate?
Both sides kind of collided into each other.
Are you a Confederate?
The lieutenant commanding the Union forces was told, don't engage, wait for your other surrounding Union cavalry to come in, and we'll capture these men.
Are there any other else right
And if
here?
we capture them, we'll learn what the Confederates are up to.
Well, that's a tall tale.
Well, being the typical bold cavalry junior officer that he was, he of course blundered into a position, bumped into Confederates. They were surprised by him as well. Shooting, shotguns going off at point blank range, pistols, men falling off their horse.
While billed as a battle, it is more often referred to as a skirmish.
You have to have so many men per side to be considered a battle or a skirmish. But out here, because it was the biggest we had, they often called it the battle. People did die. Men died, men were wounded, men were captured. So it was just a very strange, confusing battle. But it allowed the Confederates to go back and tell the main force in Tucson, they're coming. That's the California column. We can't stand for them, let's pull out now.
The Battle of Picacho Pass is thought to be the westernmost engagement of the Civil War, although weeks earlier there was a minor skirmish at Stanwix Station, nearly 200 miles west of Picacho Peak. But that's a story for another day.
Thank you for joining us here on Arizona Illustrated. Next week, locally and sustainably raised poultry, a backyard harvest of fruits, seeds, and nuts. What does it mean to be a UNESCO World City of Gastronomy? And carbon dating the Shroud of Turin in 1988. I'm Tom McNamara. See you next week.